Welcome to Pop Culture Archaeology. I'm your host, Jeffrey Shanks. I'm an archaeologist and historian, and I've spent most of my career digging up artifacts and researching and writing about peoples and societies of the past. But I'm also a huge fan of popular culture, both old and modern. Movies, books, comics, video games, pulp magazines. Not only are these things a lot of fun to talk about, they're also cultural artifacts, and studying mass culture can tell us a lot about ourselves as a society. These days, popular culture has become dominated by genre fiction, fantasy, horror, science fiction, superheroes, what we usually think of as nerd or geek culture. And that's cool with me. I'm totally a nerd, and I'm cool with that. Guilty as charged. But these days, geek culture has become mainstream. Today, the most popular TV shows are Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead. The top grossing films are Avengers and Transformers. Let's face it, jocks, the nerds have won. There's no better place to witness the new face of pop culture than the Comic-Con. Cons, or conventions celebrating different aspects of fandom, have been around for a long time, but in recent years they have exploded in both size and popularity. New cons have popped up in unlikely places, and older cons have doubled, tripled, and quadrupled in size, with some of the biggest, like New York Comic-Con, Dragon Con in Atlanta, and Fan Expo in Toronto, attracting tens of thousands of attendees. But of course, the Mac Daddy of all cons is Comic-Con International in San Diego.
At cons, you'll find dealers selling all sorts of merchandise. Comics, toys, games, costumes, you name it. There are artists doing sketches and signing comics. Publishers and studios promoting their latest projects. Celebrities signing autographs and doing panels. And of course, there are the cosplayers. Designing and wearing costumes of their favorite characters from comics, anime, and film has become a favorite activity of congoers, and some of the costumes are simply amazing.
The origin of cons actually goes back to the 1920s. This is our cultural artifact for this episode. It's the first issue of the pulp magazine Amazing Stories, published in April 1926. Briefly, pulp magazines were cheaply made fiction periodicals that were hugely popular in the first half of the 20th century. Early pulps like All Story and Argosy contained stories from many different genres. By the 1920s, pulp specializing in specific genres started to appear. There were adventure pulps, western pulps, detective pulps. By the late 20s, there was an explosion in the number of genre pulps on the newsstands, with every possible niche topic covered. Fight stories, railroad stories, speakeasy stories, even Zeppelin stories. Amazing Stories was a product of this proliferation of genre pulps. It was the first publication entirely dedicated to science fiction. In fact, the term science fiction would later be coined in its pages. At first, it was referred to as scientifiction. Fortunately, that didn't last long.
Amazing Stories was the brainchild of an inventor and futurist named Hugo Gernsback. If you've heard of the Hugo Award, the phallic-shaped rocket ship trophy that's given out every year to honor the best works in science fiction, well, that's named after Hugo Gernsback. The early years of the magazine featured original science fiction stories alongside a number of reprint stories from speculative fiction pioneers like Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. The general interest pulps, like Argosy and All Story, had run the occasional science fiction story in the past, but there had never been a magazine dedicated solely to this type of fiction. Amazing Stories immediately became the focal point for fans of these stories, and the readers began writing letters to the editor, offering suggestions and discussing what they wanted to see in the magazine. And then, something truly amazing happened. Gernsback decided to start publishing the addresses of the readers who wrote in, not just their names, something no other magazine editor did. This meant that for the first time, science fiction fans from around the country were able to communicate with each other. And communicate they did. They became correspondents, formed clubs, and began to publish their own amateur fan magazines, or fanzines, with names like The Comet and The Time Traveler. The community that formed among the early readers of Amazing Stories, many of them only teenagers, became the founding fathers of fandom. Some of those teenagers would go on to become huge names in science fiction, fantasy, and comics. There was Forrest Ackerman, who would later create the influential magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland. Mort Weisinger and Julius Schwartz, who would steer the editorial direction of DC Comics for decades. Donald Wollheim, who became one of the most prolific publishers of science fiction in the 20th century. Ray Bradbury, one of the greatest science fiction writers of all time. And of course, two teenagers from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who, in 1938, would introduce the world to the man of tomorrow, Superman. By the mid-1930s, these pioneers of fandom began arranging small get-togethers and meetups in larger cities. This ultimately led to what could be called the first true con, the World Science Fiction Convention, or Worldcon, held at the site of the New York World's Fair in the summer of 1939. While thousands of people flocked to New York to see the world of tomorrow, 200 science fiction fans gathered together to celebrate their shared interest in the fiction of the future. The guest of honor that first year was the legendary artist Frank R. Paul, whose work adorned many of the spectacular early covers of Amazing Stories. That event in 1939 also saw the first cosplay at a con, as Forrest Ackerman and his friend Myrtle James came dressed as space people or something. By the end of World War II, Worldcon had become an annual event, and the premier convention for fans of science fiction. But other cons quickly sprang up around the country and around the world. Many of the elements of the modern cons were already there. Dealer rooms, panel discussions, guest stars, and of course, cosplayers. By the 1960s, subgroups of science fiction fandom began to break away and form their own fan communities, focused on related interests like comic books, fantasy stories, monster movies, pulp heroes, and popular TV shows like Batman, Star Trek, and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. These new fan communities followed the pattern of the science fiction fans of the 1930s, corresponding with each other, creating fanzines, and eventually holding their own cons. The first real comic book conventions, or Comic-Cons, appeared in the 1960s in places like New York, Detroit, and Houston. In 1970, the show that would eventually become Comic-Con International was held in San Diego under the name Golden State Comic-Con. The early 1970s also saw the appearance of Star Trek conventions and gaming conventions like Gen Con. Throughout this time, cosplaying continued to grow in popularity, with the costumes themselves becoming more elaborate and more revealing, to the point where full nudity became commonplace. After all, it was the swinging 70s. In 1976, another historic event took place when a medium-budget space fantasy film called Star Wars was promoted at the San Diego Comic-Con and at Worldcon. The promotion consisted of little more than a booth, a slideshow with still images from the film, and a guest appearance by what appears to be a 12-year-old Mark Hamill. But this modest PR effort, which tried to appeal directly to the fans, was a huge success, creating word-of-mouth buzz which led to the massive, unprecedented ticket lines on the film's opening weekend on Memorial Day 1977. Over the next decade, several other films also had panels at San Diego, like Blade Runner and the other two Star Wars films. But it wasn't until 1988 that Hollywood really started to become aware of the marketing potential of Comic-Con. That year, the San Diego Comic-Con may have saved the big-budget Tim Burton Batman film. If you think the reaction to last year's announcement that Ben Affleck would be playing Batman was bad, it was nothing compared to the nerd rage when it was announced in early 1988 that Michael Keaton would be playing the Caped Crusader. In an effort to turn around the negative reaction, the filmmakers had a panel at Comic-Con and showed scenes from the set and got Batman co-creator Bob Kane to make an appearance to endorse the film. This apparently worked as the negative buzz died and the film went on to break box office records. After that, a few smart filmmakers began to realize that if you're producing a big-budget genre film, you're foolish if you don't have some kind of presence at Comic-Con. Throughout the 1990s, Comic-Con slowly began its transition from a comic book convention into a media trade show. The summer of 2000 was a watershed moment in that transformation,
with the debut of X-Men, the movie that began the era of the modern superhero film. It was also the year the first Lord of the Rings movie debuted, and those two films dominated Comic-Con that summer, necessitating the creation of a massive hall to accommodate the thousands of fans that wanted to see the panels. After that, Comic-Con International's destiny was set, as it became the main venue for 21st century Hollywood to premiere and promote its biggest films and projects.
Comic-Con International has now become the mecca of popular culture, with well over 100,000 attendees every year. Other cons around the country have followed the same model, moving beyond just comic books and becoming mass media conventions, combining diverse fandom communities into huge, multi-genre events that celebrate the many facets of popular culture.
So, the next time you fanboys and fangirls are at a con, squeezing your way through the dealer's room in your gender-swap Sailor Moon outfit on the way to the Walking Dead panel to hear Norman Reedus pontificate on how zombies are a metaphor for suburban consumerism, remember where it all began. In the Pulp magazine, Amazing Stories, 90 years ago. I'm Jeffrey Shanks, and this has been Pop Culture Archaeology.